Before I can prime and paint this Kabuto Kai, I gotta seam up some cleans. Dang it. Before I can prime and paint this Kabuto Kai, I gotta clean up some seams. Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. I want to get our Kabuto Kai primed and painted in this episode, hopefully. But there's quite a few seams that I have to deal with. There's everything from this big gap back here to figuring out how I want to deal with things like that, to the seams right there, those gaps right there. And then of course on the legs, there's some pretty big honking seams there. So all of these are going to take a slightly different approach to deal with. Some of the gaps, like these that are along here, are fairly easy to deal with. I just get my Mr. Surfacer 500, which has dried up a bit, and it's actually down to about, I guess, Mr. Surfacer 295. But I just get a big blob of it on there. And I just push that kind of into those gaps, and then I'll come back later. And I think I've demonstrated this before. I'll come back later and just clean up the excess with a cotton bud soaked in alcohol. And it'll leave the Mr. Surfacer in the gap. There'll still be enough of a gap that it will appear as a panel line, but I'm okay with that. I don't think this area would need to be a flush fit if it were a real object. These seams on the front of the leg are rather egregious, so there's a lot of things I could do. I could try and take my knife and scrape that down some. I could put some putty over it and try and gently sand it back, but you know what? I think there's a point, especially when you're dealing with a flat surface like this, that you just say, I'm going to blast this thing away. I'm just going to get my 180 grit and dipping it in water. I'm just going to sand plastic away. There's enough plastic here, and it's close enough to being flat that I can go in and just say, I'm going to take this thing down to where the glue has welded the parts together, and then I can go back in with, and again, wet sanding. I'll get my 240, clean that up a bit, and you can probably guess the next one, if I can find it, 320. And then I'll just skip on up to 600. And again, all of these are wet sanding. And I'm doing this circular fashion to try and buff out any scratch marks. But I'll just go with that. Once I hit primer over it, it'll cover up that discoloration. But sometimes, you know, I try to, if the seam is not real big, I may start at, 400 or 600 and really try and work it and finesse it. But I've found there's plenty of times that if I just want to get something done, break out the big honking stick and sand it down and tell the plastic who's boss, and things will go well. Now I just got to get the rest of this done on all four legs. Sometimes I do like to use Vallejo's plastic putty. It's not as durable as something like Tamiya putty for big gaps, and certainly if it's going to be in any areas that are going to need to be load bearing, like the wing of an airplane or something like that, I wouldn't recommend it because it comes apart fairly easily under stress. But for some simple areas like this, where I just want to get it in there and get it cleaned up fairly quick, and I'm not too worried about the strength of it, pardon my reach, I get that on there, and then I just take a cotton bud, soak it in water, and I just clean that up like that. Now it may leave a little bit of a seam. I may have to do 2 applications, but it only takes a few applications of this to build it up. so that it does a fairly credible job of filling the seam. And like if you look close, you can see that I'm going to need to do a second application. But once I've done a couple of applications, this stuff dries really fast. Once I've done a couple of applications of this, it should be good to go. And that's very hard to sand in there. So using this stuff, quick and easy, and no bad odor or anything like that. Now, sometimes when you got something like that, I could put in putty and filler all day long and do all sorts of crazy nonsense. I could sand that, you know, it could take quite a while. But sometimes the easiest thing to do is just cover it up with more plastic. So for this, I'm just going to quick cut a sheet like that. And I'm going to put it here, and I'm just going to eyeball it. And I want to cut it about here, like that. And then I'll cut it, about here, like that. Now I'm leaving some overhang to do this. But all I'll do is I'll glue that in place with Tamiya Extra Thin, and I'll line it up on this side so that it's fairly flush. And then after I give it a good time to dry, I mean, you want to give it like 24 hours to dry, but after I give it a good time to dry, I'll just come in with my X-Acto knife and just simply cut off the overhanging edges and then treat it with Mr. Surfacer. And this way, I don't have to mess with a lot of sanding and filling and everything else like that. I'll just cover the doggone thing up. And having this thin plastic card handy for that, I always keep plenty of this around because it can do a whole lot for you. I'll just add some more glue to that, push it down so that it's flat, and that'll take care of that. Now for cleanup in these areas that I put the Mr. Surfacer on, and I've shown this before, but I just thought I'd briefly demonstrate it again in case somebody hasn't seen it. This is alcohol here in this squirt bottle. I just took the lid off, I dip a cotton bud in, and I just go in and I start rubbing it like this. And it'll take it a little bit, but once it activates that surface level of Mr. Surfacer, it'll start pulling that up, and the only thing that'll be left is what's in the gap. Now you have to do this. It's been about 20 minutes since I first applied this, and you have to do this. The sooner you can do it, the better. Once it's touch dry is the time to do it. I've done it as long as overnight after putting it on and forgot to take it off. But the longer you wait, the harder it is to clean up. So, and you see I'm having to work it pretty good even after just 20 minutes. So do be aware of that if you're going to use this technique. It favors you if you do it sooner than later for the cleanup. All I do is just go around and just rub all this stuff up. You have to go through quite a few cotton buds, but it works really well. Okay, after way too much sanding and filling and sanding and filling and on ad nauseum, I got things ready for priming. I went ahead and assembled the legs. This is the back set, and they're quite wobbly. So my plan originally was to consider gluing everything together once I had it in position. I think it's definitely going to be required because this thing just flops around. There's no polycaps or anything like that, and it's not even particularly tight joints or anything like that. So yeah, it definitely will need a little help. But it's done. I've got it as good as I think I'm going to get it, and I'm just going to live with it. Anything that shows up later, I'll just cover up in weathering. All right, and here you can see it loosely fitted together, and it's a pretty big model when you get all of it together like this. But it's definitely not got real positive connections in the joints, because if I turn loose, it just kind of falls apart. So I guess the next step is going to be to figure out, do I try and glue the legs in a fixed position first and then prime and paint it, or do I try and prime and paint it and then glue the legs? Let me play with that for a little bit, and I'll figure out what to do. But the next thing you'll see will be the priming and the painting. All right, let me catch you up as to where I'm at with this. First, my gosh, the amount of sanding I had to do on this thing. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I spent about 4 hours sanding seams and trying to get things blended in. Some of it, I just decided it is what it is. I'm just going to leave it. I got sick of sanding because I sanded for a while. I primed it. I saw more places I needed to sand. I filled and I sanded, and I saw more places, and I filled and I sanded, and I saw more places. And like I said, I just decided enough is enough. That's all I'm doing. So this thing is just going to have some seam marks on it. I'm going to add some stains, maybe add some dirt effects, maybe add some chips, do whatever I can to cover it up. But yeah, this was quite a challenge. I ended up gluing the legs in place before priming and painting, but that was an adventure in and of itself. What I ended up having to do was mount the legs, or mount the cab on the legs, and man, they were flopping around everywhere. And then I basically used, I think it was this bottle of Micro Set. I just set underneath it so that it would hold it up. And then I began positioning the legs. I had to tape the legs to the bottom of it. And then I began positioning the legs and just taping them in place. And then once I had them taped into place and it was level, mostly, then I just began dropping in glue around the various joints. And I would give it half an hour, and I'd come back and I'd see what still moved, and I would readjust it, and I would put more glue on. And after probably about 3 hours of that, I got everything glued together that I wanted to. And then I thought about, I hadn't mounted the guns. And so I test fitted one of the guns, and I had mounted the whole positioning of the thing too low. So I had to break all the glue joins and start over. Yeah. So now the legs are glued in place. The only thing I didn't glue was the feet, so that when I'm done, when I'm at the end and I'm wanting to, and I've got everything glued together, I can kind of have a little bit of movement there to get it as level as possible. We'll see how that turns out. The way things have been going, I'm expecting this thing is going to be sitting at an angle and one leg up in the air, and a gun pointed one way and a gun pointed the other. Who knows? But got that glued together, primed it with, what did I prime it with? Oh, Tamiya rattle can primer. And then the color I painted on is just Tamiya Buff. I don't remember the number. I don't have it here in front of me, but it's Tamiya Buff. Which I wanted this to have a desert look, so I think Tamiya Buff is just kind of a generic desert tan that works really well for just about anything. It's kind of like, if you're looking for just a generic gray, neutral gray is perfect for that. Tamiya Buff is, I think, perfect for neutral desert. So I've given that a base coat of that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to put a green color. I think I'm going to use Tamiya's Japan Ground Self-Defense Force Green. I think it will work well with this. It's either XF72 or 73, I can't remember. But I'm going to put that in just kind of a splotchy pattern over this. Now to do that so that it all looks one piece, I'm actually going to assemble the model and tape the legs on, put the guns on, and paint the pattern with the model together so that it looks cohesive, and then I can pull it back apart for the weathering. But if you build this, and I still recommend this kit because it is fun. There's a lot to commend it, but be prepared to do some seam work. In fact, I would say the biggest mistake I made was gluing these armor pieces on before I addressed all of the seams on the legs themselves. And then these pieces right here, where they join right there, I should have just made that a seam line, a panel line. I shouldn't have even bothered trying to close that up. That was just almost a bridge too far. Some of this other stuff, the edges around here and all of that, man, that took a long time. And then look here, I put that up to cover up the seam. I put on so much glue that the plastic sunk in there, and I just decided I'm going to leave that. There's going to be a dimple there, but oh well. All right, I've dry fitted everything together for painting, and just to show how big this thing is, let me put a few things up here for comparison. Here's a Tamiya extra thin bottle. Here's a 1/35th scale machining Krieger kit. Here's my hobby knife. This is a pretty big model. I mean, it's as long as my hand, and easily as far across as my hand. I have fairly big hands, so this is a pretty big chunk of a model when you get everything together. But even just this dry fit was, oh my gosh, it ain't the best fitting kit ever. Okay, here's a bit of an insight into the middle of the painting process. I took the dry fitted model, took it in there to the airbrush room, put in the XF73, that's what it is, XF73. And I just roughed in, because I'm just going to be doing these streaks of green, and I just roughed in a pattern, basically just coming across the top like that, and getting in a few different angles and just giving me some key places to see where the lines are. Now what I'll do is I'll pull the thing apart, and I'll go back in and I'll fill in these spaces. Like here, I'll bring it down here and across there and across the front of the leg. Here I'll bring it down like this. Here I'll bring it down the side of the gun. So the idea is, once it's done, and then I'll do some cleanup with the tan. Once it's done, when you look at it from above, it should be a fairly cohesive pattern. When you look at it from the side, it should be fairly cohesive. The idea is to break up the outline. But by doing this rough painting first, it gives me, I guess you'd say, the markers for where all the patterns need to go. And then I just build on that. And then I can go back in, like I said, later with the buff and just clean up any edges and any rough spots that happened by using this method. But it makes it real easy to kind of define your pattern, and you don't have to sit there and try and turn the model into 50 different crazy configurations to try and get at it. You get your rough pattern in, take it apart, fill it back in. All right, well, the paint is on, and I did, as I talked about, I filled in and completed the lines based on those rough ones I'd done in. And then I went back with the buff and cleaned it up a little bit. There's some white splotchy marks. I actually used alcohol to thin the buff for the cleanup. And it sometimes when you're getting in real close, it'll leave those white marks. I'm not too worried about it because later weathering is going to blend that in, cover that up. It's just going to seem like part of it, so I'm not even worried about it at this point. But you can see that it just, you know, when you look at it from up here, it looks like it's supposed to be that way, and when you look at it from the side, it's just all kind of cohesive as a unit. So just got some little squigglies and things like that on it. I'm imagining, what I'm imagining is this vehicle was tan, and one of the senior NCOs sent a bunch of privates out and said, we'll just give it a camouflage job. And so they went and painted these stripes on it, and then they come out and look at it, and they said, it needs more camo. And so they went in and put in these dots and squiggles and stuff like that. Kind of a lazy method of filling it in. And I know that stuff like this happens because I was in the Army, and I remember stuff like that specifically. So that's kind of my motivation to it, is just a nod to my own past in the military. But anyway, now that I've got that paint on, the next step I want to do is add a few decals. And because I'm imagining this as a straw vehicle in the Machining Krieger universe, that's the decals I'm going to use. Now I've got two very different sets here. I've got one from the Vega Altair that I recently did, which are, as I'm looking at them, are probably way too out of scale to use. I may use some of the stencils, but the rest of it just seems way too out of scale. And then I've got this little set here from one of the little Machining Krieger 1/35 scale. I don't remember the name, the Japanese name, but they come in the little round pods. You know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, it's just a little model. But I've got some of those decals, and I actually think that between using some of maybe these smaller letters here and numbers here and some of the ones here, I may be able to cobble something together. A few years ago, I was watching a video of Mig Jimenez, the very famous armor modeler and the guy behind Ammo of Mig. He was doing his model, and he was just talking about adding different things. And someone asked him, "Did you put any kind of gloss coat or clear coat on the model?" And he explained that he generally did not do that because that made the whole model glossy, of course, if you're thinking about a gloss coat. And then he said it didn't look natural, essentially. And at the time I thought, yeah, but what about decals and washes and all that stuff? Well, the more I've worked on this type of model, I heard that back when I was doing aircraft models. The more I've worked on models like this, sci-fi, armor type things, the Warhammer stuff, the more I've started to understand what he was talking about. That any object is going to have a vehicle, a bulldozer, airplane, whatever. It's going to have areas that are gloss. It's going to have areas that are satin. It's going to have areas that are flat, depending on the weathering and the paint and all of that other stuff. So I've gotten to where on models where there's only a few decals, I don't gloss coat the whole model. I don't even gloss coat a spot because that'll change the finish. What I do to help make sure that the decals go on well is I just take this little piece of cotton cloth that I have specifically for this purpose, and I just buff down the area where I'm going to put on the decal. That smooths out the paint, smooths out the surface, and then I can put the decal on, and I'll use some of this micro set under it. Then I can put the decal on, put the solva set over it, and it generally goes on without any problems. As long as you use a Q-tip or something like that to work out any air bubbles, it works fine. Now, if you're doing a model, like let's say you're doing an aircraft model which has a lot of decals on it, I would still gloss coat something like that. Or if you're not comfortable with doing it without a gloss coat, then put on the gloss coat. But I've done this enough now, and I've kind of begun to understand what Mig was talking about to feel comfortable with saying, you know, I'm just not going to clear coat it. I'm just going to put my decals on, take a few precautions, and work with it. So anyway, that's the approach I'm going to be taking with the decals. All right, you've seen me do this before, so I won't go into a lot of detail and explanation. I'm just going to take my decal, hold it in some tweezers, and off it goes into some warm water off camera. I'll set it on the paper towel there to damp it off just a little. Apply a good dose of my micro set. Put the decal on. Get the decal positioned. Work out the moisture and the air from underneath it with a cotton bud. And finally apply a little bit of solva set all around the decal. Now once I've applied the solva set, I leave it be. If I touch the decal now, it's going to smear the decal. So I'll let that dry for a while, and then I'll look at it. If I see any bubbles or anything like that, I'll just take my hobby knife, make a little slice in it, put some more solva set on it, and that'll take care of it. Alright, I just put on a few decals. I decided not to do any stencils. I think I'm going to rely on weathering to kind of make the exterior surface interesting. Anyway, I put that number 8 on the guns on either side. I put one up here on the front, a very small number 8, one on the back. And then I picked this kind of black cat logo to use there. And I just thought it'd be something that maybe the crew would put on, personalize it a little bit. Anyway, it just looks like it's supposed to be there. Anyway, I think I'm going to call this a video. Got it all assembled and painted and some decals on, so the next one will, of course, start the weathering. But if you're looking at this model and you're thinking, hey, maybe I'll build that. If you're thinking you want to build it because it's a super cool looking model and you really like the design and you're willing to put up with all the sanding, go for it. If you're thinking, that looks different, I think I'll build it just because it's different, and you don't like sanding and filling seams and all of that stuff, this might not be the model for you. It's not hard to build, it's just tedious. That's all it is. But I think it looks cool enough that I'm going to, of course, keep pushing on that, and I've already committed to doing it on video, so got that going for me, which is nice. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and call this a wrap because I want to get this finished up and rendered and out for you guys. I appreciate your patience with getting this one done, and for being a patron. This is a Patreon exclusive video, and I am most grateful that you are supporting me in my work. It's a blessing to me. It's a blessing to my family, and that's not lost on me, that you're making a sacrifice for me to be able to do this, and that it really does help us out. So I'm super grateful, and thank you very much. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you haven't gotten something beneficial out of it, at least it's maybe filled some time and helped you drift off to sleep. So anyway, with all that being said, I'll close as I always do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye. Oh, John, you're an idiot. You had paint on your thumbnail the whole time. Oh well.